Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Lectern. I'm John Vervaeke, and I'm joined here with somebody who's become a good friend. He's a colleague. We do quite a bit of showing up together at places where Neoplatonism is a topic of discussion. He's written an amazing series of books on the imagination. I'm using his text, The Iconic Imagination, in my upcoming course on the cognitive science of the imagination, realizing the imaginal. And we are going to discuss, reflect upon, and this is part of an ongoing sort of ad hoc series, this astonishing book by James Filler, Heidegger, Neoplatonism, and the History of Being, Relation as Ontological Ground. And as many of you know, I've been making the case for this and how it sits well with our best cognitive science, our emerging cutting-edge physics, and the non-dual interpretation of mystical experiences. So I'm gonna welcome Douglas and then ask him to tell us a little bit more specifically about himself, and then we'll take it away. So welcome, Douglas.
Thank you, John, for your very kind invitation. So I'm Douglas Hedley, and I teach the philosophy of religion at the University of Cambridge. And my intellectual career started off, I suppose, with a book about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And it was really through Coleridge that I discovered a certain Platonic tradition that I think was in my bones anyway, from quite an early stage. And then my work on Coleridge led me on to a group of thinkers called the Cambridge Platonists. So forgive me for this shameless bit of
plug away.
Self aggrandizement. And generally, my interest is in the great metaphysical tradition of the West, so the philosophy of religion in a broader dimension, I suppose, and shaped particularly by the Platonic tradition. And if I may, again, advertise just another recent edited volume,
book. Yes.
Participation in the Divine, which is about this. In a way, I think it's profoundly relevant to the excellent book that we will be talking about today.
Thank you, Douglas. I hope to have Douglas back on at a later date to talk about that book he just held up, because it is a wonderful anthology. And thank you for helping to put that together, Douglas. It's a really wonderful book. So I'm not going to refer to Filler. I know James, he's a friend, and so I'm going to call him James, but I'm talking about James Filler throughout. And so I will give what I take to be sort of an overview of the core schematic of the arguments that are made. And then I'll ask Douglas to where he wants to chime in, where he wants to challenge, where he wants to elucidate. So James is making the following argument. First of all, he makes a conceptual analytic argument to the effect that substance ontology, and let me quickly explain that, because we have changed the notion of substance in some ways from what James is talking about. So he means it in an Aristotelian sense. A good way to get a sort of a good approximation of something that gets very technical in philosophy is think about how language is divided up into subjects and predicates, nouns and verbs. And the idea is that reality is kind of divided up in a similar fashion. There are the noun things; those are the substances, and they have verbs, right? And so the structure of language and the structure of logic is the fundamental structure of reality. And then this is the idea that reality is actually made up of substances that are in various relations to things. Just like you have subjects in a sentence that are related via the predicate, the verbs to other things. And then Aristotle, of course, famously built a metaphysical vision on this, and it gets taken up into various streams within the medieval period scholasticism. It gets taken up in the scientific age by Descartes, but he fundamentally changes it, and he moves it more towards our understanding of substance as sort of the foundational stuff of reality. But Let's think of it more as a critique of the idea that the world is made up of self-standing things that bear relation to other things, which is a very common sense way of looking at the world. So James's argument goes to the following. He says the problem with this is if you think that that reality is ultimately made up of these substantial things, you have a problem accounting for relations. Because if you make so let's say there's two things. A is related to B. Okay. If you make the relationship a property of A, then you don't need B to have a relation. And that makes no sense because you need both entities. So if you say, A is taller than B and you don't need B, A can just be taller on its own. That makes no sense. And of course, by same exact argument, the relation can't be a property of B. So then where is the relation? Then you have to have that it's some independent thing existing. And then you've already undermined your claim that the world is primarily made up of substantial things, because now these relations have to exist in their own right. And then how can the relations exist in their own right? How are they existing? And so once you get to that point, then James makes an additional move. He says, but we actually have to use the relations to understand any of the things. Because if anything we want to say about a thing immediately puts it in relation. So if the thing has any understandability, the more technical word for that is any intelligibility. If we have any information about the thing, that it's immediately in relation. We set up a relation. It's, whatever we want to say about the thing. Even saying it's on its own is to differentiate it from everything else and put it into relation. So then James says, you can't get relations out of things, and things, the relations are necessary for us to have any information or intelligibility about things. And then he's making use of an implicit premise, which is we judge the realness of things by how much information or intelligibility we have of them. And so he says, look, you can't get the relations from the things, and the things are only real to us from the relations. So relationality, the relations have to be primary. They have to be what reality ultimately is. Now I've pushed James a little on this, and he didn't challenge me. I said, James, isn't it the case though that you've made a great argument that you can't get, I'm going to use a technical term. Relata means the things that are in relation. You can't get the relata from the relations. But I said, I can make an exactly symmetrical argument, exactly like the one you just made, showing you that you can't get relations. You can't get the relata out of the relations. Exactly the same, a symmetrical argument. And he said, and I said, this points towards a more primordial notion, very much like a Zen notion of shunyata, that the relata and the relations co-emerge out of something more primordial, what I call pure relationality. And then this lines up with, is convergent with the way, the particle and the field co-emerge in science, or matter and energy co-emerge, or the wave and the photon, the wave and the particle of light co-emerge, or space and time co-emerge, etc. And he said, that's a very powerful argument. And that argument, to my mind, doesn't do anything to undermine his other two arguments, which I'll quickly go over. One is that the Neoplatonic tradition, especially as held by the Cappadocian Fathers and held into the Eastern Orthodox version of Christianity, actually captures this notion with a purely relational idea of the Trinity as ultimate reality, where the relata are themselves inherently relational beings because they are roles, Father, Son, Spirit, and they're begotten or proceed from each other. And you can get the gist of this argument. The argument is that the Trinity is a participatory symbol. It's not just a sign. It's something we can experience, right? Is a participatory symbol of relationality as the ultimate ground. And that's his second core argument. And then the third argument is, and this is one that he's joined by a growing host of scholars, Stephen Gersh, Alexandrov, Robert Capobianco, arguing that Heidegger is basically a Neoplatonist, although he doesn't admit it. And this is largely because Heidegger has a serious misreading of Plato, and then he sort of villainizes Plato, and then that gets taken up by postmodernism. The one thing that holds postmodernism together is the hatred of Plato. And so all of that is seriously under important revision. James joins in on that chorus of argument, saying that the Neoplatonic tradition, which has been very important about bringing us back to a proper orientation of being, especially the later Heidegger, can be properly understood as something very, if not a species of, at least deeply convergent with Neoplatonism. And then that allows us to propose strongly Neoplatonism as both a response to modernity and postmodernity. And I tried to summarize a lot with just so you have a context and a background. You can watch the video. We'll make a link here where I discuss this with James. But after doing this, and I proposed this to James, I said, there's a bunch of people I need to talk to. I'm going to talk to Bishop Maximus, who's an Eastern Orthodox bishop. He's reading the book. And then I said, I have to talk to Douglas. Douglas is one of the great scholars about the Neoplatonic tradition and one of the strong advocates for its revival as a response to what I call the meaning crisis and other issues at work. So, Douglas, that's my initial setting the stage. And now I'll allow you to take center stage where you want to make comments, challenges, moves.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your beautiful and lucid account of James's book. Could I just say from the outset that I am in agreement with what the Germans might call the ursprüngliche Einsicht, or the original insight of James's book. But I have some questions about some of the moves and some of the emphases. So
Sure.
I just want to sort of preface my remarks with lauding this remarkable contribution to the literature. And I think part of a broader revival of interest in this Neoplatonic tradition. Before I go into my queries about James's account, I'd just like to note that there's probably another perspective which is worth mentioning in relation to our common interest in the imagination. And that is that one of the differences, and this is of course rather schematic, between Plato and Aristotle, is that Plato, and this was very important for the Neoplatonists, claims that the good is beyond being, epikena tesousias. Of course, there's an enormous amount of ink spilt on what that means. But one implication could be that rather than for Aristotle, where philosophy is the categorical determination of the T of a particular item, so what it is, so this conceptual analysis of the nature of reality. For the Platonist, because the good in some mysterious sense transcends being, whatever he means by being, then we are forced into this dialectical relationship, and sometimes perhaps paradoxical relationship, between what he calls logos and mythos. So we need the language of the imagination. We need symbols. We need myths, perhaps, in order to give a full account of the reality that we encounter. So that, and I think that's one reason why Platonism has been so important for the poets, for the artists. There's a sense in which the Platonic tradition is already linked into a caution about the power of the purely conceptual to delineate the nature of reality. So I just want to throw that in as a preliminary thought. So first of all, I'll start from the end of your analysis. So with the Heidegger, because I mean, when I was a student, the tendency was either to imitate Heidegger and to write in a rather baffling Heideggerian mode that, so you were either in the club or you weren't, so the Heideggerians would sort of imitate the master, or they would ignore Heidegger altogether. And many of us will be familiar with the attacks on Heidegger linked to his rather unfortunate history in that very difficult time of German politics. I mean, I think that's more confusing and more ambiguous than the critics make out, but that's, I think, one of the reasons for a downplaying of Heidegger's significance. Now, it seems to me clearly he's a momentous figure and one of the great philosophers of traditions. I think there's no doubt about that. And he's also interesting in terms of the profound theological dimension to Heidegger. I mean, I think this is one thing that a lot of students of philosophy, for maybe cultural reasons, fail to realize just how significant theology is as a backdrop for understanding our intellectual inheritance. And Heidegger is a typical instance of this. There's a very fine scholar called Kiesel who has written a book on the theological roots of being in time, where he explores in great detail figures like Schleiermacher and Luther and Augustine, and how these figures were very important for the writing of being in time. And I'd also mention a figure that is little known, but I think was important for Heidegger's upbringing as a student in Freiburg. And this was a figure called Karl Braig. And Braig actually wrote a book called Vom Sein, about being, right? So that's a bit of a giveaway.
Yeah.
And Braig was a sort of Neoplatonically influenced romantic. So I think there are, if you look into the history of Heidegger, you can see why this theological element is there. It's complicated, but I think it's no surprise. Another figure, by the way, I think who's significant is Schelling, and particularly the later Schelling. Heidegger, of course, writes a commentary on Schelling's book on freedom. So that would be my first point about this deep theological backdrop to Heidegger. However, one should also realize that, strangely enough, Germany, when Heidegger was studying, was not really a center of Neoplatonic studies.
Yeah.
And in fact, the curriculum was dominated by a sort of romantic, I mean, in the worst sense, romantic view of the history of philosophy, in which you have an organic view of the philosophical tradition of the West, and particularly antiquity, whereby philosophy, ancient philosophy in its infancy, is that of the pre-Socratics. It comes to its adulthood in Plato and Aristotle. It then develops into a rather stolid Middle Age in Hellenistic philosophy, Stoicism, and then collapses into decrepitude, mysticism, and emanation in late antiquity. Now, that was basically the view of philosophy that Heidegger was inheriting at a time when there was a revival of Neoplatonism in England with Dean Ing, the gloomy dean of London, St. Paul's in London, who said, my name rhymes with sting, and Émile Brillet, who wrote a pivotal book on Plotinus. So in a way, we shouldn't blame Heidegger for the fact that he didn't know very much about Neoplatonism. that I think was part of the context in which he emerged. So even his book on Augustine doesn't have very much to say about the influence of Plotinus or Porphyry on Augustine. So, but the the influence of Heidegger's, I would say, lack of knowledge of Neoplatonism on his epigones has been extraordinary.
Yes, yeah.
Both of the sort of left-wing Heideggerians and indeed the sort of right-wing Heideggerians. I won't mention any names here, but there are some, theologians who say, yes, of course, we have to avoid ontotheology as Heidegger presents it. But if you understand Denis the Areopagite, then you can see that he wasn't committed to ontotheology and he escapes Heidegger's critique. So I think that there's one of the interesting aspect of James's book is that he takes Heidegger seriously as a philosopher. He doesn't go into this rather schematic, Heidegger's given us all the answers, and I think wants to read Heidegger in a rather Neoplatonic way, malgré lui. So I think that's a very interesting aspect of James's book.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Most of the authors that I mentioned don't claim that Heidegger is a Neoplatonist. They claim that there's a convergence between what Heidegger is doing, especially the later Heidegger, and certain Neoplatonic themes. So are you largely in agreement with his proposal, though, that reading of Heidegger, while not, totally perhaps exegetically accurate, because we're sort of foisting a responsibility on Heidegger that he couldn't meet, as you've just clearly. Nevertheless, and that's why I use the word convergent. There's a convergent reading of that then says, given the centrality of certain Heideggerian arguments, like the ontotheological critique, and that there's a viable Neoplatonic response to the ontotheological critique. And I see James's core argument as being exactly that, which is, no, there's a way to respond to the ontotheological critique that nevertheless is, found within the tradition, or at least precursors within the tradition, and it is also a viable framework for a rich religious and spiritual life, namely the Neoplatonic. How does that proposal land with you?
Yes, no. I think that sounds right to me, and I think it's also tied up with Heidegger's complicated relationship with Christianity as well. Actually, yes. I mean, Father Bernhard Welter actually gave a requiem mass for Martin Heidegger in the Church of St. Martin. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, and I think, of course, we're not talking about some ascent of the soul to the one in Heidegger. So he's not a sort of card-carrying Neoplatonist. I mean, I think that's what we mean. But I think what James does very plausibly is to explore ways in which there's a genuine affinity between Heidegger's thought and this Neoplatonic tradition that he inherited through a certain Christian transmission, Meister Eckhart, Gelassenheit, and to some extent Hölderlin. So, I mean, I think the idea that, Dasein is the receptacle of the, and some of this is difficult to translate, but, the Heideggerian notion of the Ankunft des Seins, the being as emerging, the idea in the early, being in time, that the Stimmung, there's this beautiful idea that the mood, which is pre-conceptual.
Yes.
There's another term in German, the Befindlichkeit. So it's the way that you find yourself in the world. I mean, this beautiful critique of the Cartesian subject, but that Stimmung, or that mood, is the way in which you grasp the ungraspable. You become attuned to reality. I mean, it's very powerful, and I think drawing in a creative way on a certain genuinely Neoplatonic tradition, I would say.
That's good, Douglas. I appreciate that. But I want to pick up on a point you just made. I mean, Capobianco and others have pointed there, and John Caputo did his book, The Mystical Element in Heidegger's Thought, because of the influence of Eckhart and others. And of course, there's a conversation with probably D.T. Suzuki, the Japanese person, Zen. And so there is a mystical dimension, but there is an antipathy. So maybe in addition to a hatred of Plato, one of the things that unites both modernity and postmodernity is an antagonism towards any strong sense of transcendence. And let me explain what I mean by that. We of course have a reduced notion, a merely psychological notion of transcendence as self-actualization, kind of Maslow. Even though at the end of his career, Maslow was proposing self-transcendence as beyond self-realization. Many people don't realize that. So we have this notion, which is largely a Nietzschean notion of, well, we can actualize ourselves, we can overcome ourselves. What I mean by strong transcendence is a sense of transcendence in which there are epistemological and ontological important consequences. That transcendence discloses truths to us about the world that otherwise can't be known. So it's not just we get increased self-knowledge. Aspects or dimensions of reality disclose themselves to us. And then ontological, we have a sense of knowing not as merely representational, but as, as contact epistemology, as conformity, as participation. And so we become in some ways different. And I think strong transcendence is one of the central claims of the Neoplatonic tradition, that this is not, of course, it's not excluding the psychological, but the transcendent is not just psychological. It is, right? It is both. It has epistemological and ontological significance. And what I want to put to you is modernity rejects strong transcendence because they have a very flattening ontology, and there's a largely a drift towards a nominalist idea that there's nothing out there but sort of individuals and that sort of thing. And we can get into reductionism if we have to, but the modernity doesn't like strong transcendence. Hence why we get this push towards, merely psychological transcendence. And of course, postmodernism hates the word transcendence, and the idea of it being anything beyond the Nietzschean prospect is very troublesome to them because, it seems to invoke a meta narrative or a reality beyond the propositional text and all these kinds of things. Now, you said that Neoplatonism really emphasizes the ascent to the one, which I think is a way of, and I'm going to use your term, imaginally or mythologically talking about strong transcendence. And that I would put it to you that you're right about this about Heidegger, that I think there's an antipathy towards this. I mean, he talks about ecstasis, but if you'll allow me a metaphor, it's vertical. I mean, it's horizontal. It's ecstasis to the world, but there's no ecstasis this way. There's no verticality. And the verticality, I mean, Rosen made this argument a long time ago in his critique of Heidegger. The verticality is missing. And that seems to me to be one way in which he strongly is not a Neoplatonist. I'm sorry, that was a rather long argument, but how does that land for you?
Yeah, I think that's, I think that fits in, I think, with the view that he was a sort of mystical atheist.
Yes.
And I think there's certainly, but another way of looking at, let me put another view to you.
Please,
we can debate. So, on the one hand, there's this sort of rather, I would say, clunky narrative of the onto-theological constitution of metaphysics, where you've got the influence of Nietzsche is particularly strong, and then the view of metaphysics as this decadent forgetting, And so now that, of course, is so crude. I mean, so for one thing, the idea that metaphysics is ignorant of the difference between Sein and the being and being. So, well, I mean, as you know, Plotinus says quite explicitly that the one is pro to t. It's before any categorical determination. So there's the difference is quite explicitly. And also, I know that you're particularly fascinated by the relationship of actuality and potentiality, how we think of those two together. Well, the one for Plotinus is the dunamis panton. It's the potential of all, the mightiness of all, the capacity of all. I mean, so far from Plotinus representing some sterile, static substance metaphysics, as James says, this is this very dynamic conception that Heidegger himself is basically oblivious to, or simply replaces with this rather schematic Nietzschean caricature. But in a way, Heidegger's a correction of his own thesis, because he shows himself how tempting the Neoplatonic tradition is, because even though he doesn't quite come out with something like the full Neoplatonic story, he's nudging towards it. So I would say that even more so in the later Heidegger, you have aspects that come very close to the Neoplatonic, metaphysical drive.
Yeah, Alexandrov's really excellent book. I recommend it. The Other Platonist Beginning. He does this very tight and deep exegetical hermeneutics on the late Heidegger, and then weaves it into exactly what you said, and then goes into Plotinus and Proclus and shows these themes. It's also an excellent book.
I mean, Schopenhauer has this great quip about, Kant. He says, Kant's like a man at a masked ball, and you take the mask off the lady that he's been dancing with, and you find it's theology. And I think you could say the same about Heidegger. That in a way, like Kant, you think you've got this secular philosopher who's operating with this severe critique of the inherited theological tradition and the metaphysical tradition. But when you dig away, you find that it's this metaphysical theological tradition is animating so much of what he's doing.
I really appreciate that, and I know that that's a prominent and well articulated and developed theme in a lot of your work. And I've been talking about, and we'll not go down this this rabbit hole. I've been talking about how theology is going to be the discipline of the future with the advent of AGI and things like that, because the preconceptual to the post-conceptual dimension of our being and how it relates to ultimacy is going to become more and more pronounced as what distinguishes us from these sort of techno-economical intelligences. And so I think theology, I've been literally publicly saying that. But that brings me to James's sort of second argument, which I want to get moved to, which is, so he makes this proposal, and my Eastern Orthodox friends are going, Jonathan Pajot and Bishop Maximus, so of course, are going to love this, but he makes this proposal that, and I think this is at least partly in agreement with what you just said, is that this never went away. This way we're talking about, relationality and strong transcendence and a proper place for mystical experiences of non-duality, etc. That never went away because we had this other tradition, at least in European civilization, of, and I know you'll be able to say the West has this too. So I'm not denying that, but I'm just saying what James's argument is. that Eastern Orthodox Christianity, especially through the Cappadocian Fathers, right, really like grasps this, holds on to this. And Bishop Maximus said he thinks that, Eastern Orthodoxy is the place where you get, the best sort of living version of Neoplatonism. So these are theses on the table for us to discuss. And the idea that particularly that you have a non-ontotheological understanding of the Trinity running through that tradition thoroughly, and Eckhart, of course, talks about it, the no-thingness of God and things like this. And this is pronounced. But this idea that the Trinity properly understood is not the pronouncement of, right, a substance thing as the most appropriate model of God, but as a representation of ultimate reality. I'll say symbol, meaning a participatory symbol of the fact that ultimate reality is this kind of pure relationality that lies below the relata and the relation. And I think there's something right about that. And I said this to James, and I want to hear what you said, but I had a bit of a pushback. First of all, to compliment James, that was the first time in my tortured relationship with Christianity where the Trinity resonated with me, and it wasn't just sort of some absurd thing that I was forced to assert to that just made no sense. It was like, oh, I get what this is pointing to now, or could point to. But I said, but there's the notion of person. And I said, I granted the Greek, hypostasis is different. I'm already giving you that latitude. But I said, prototypically, Aristotle's examples of substances are persons. That's a prototypical example. And is it not the case that understanding the Trinity in terms of person binds you back into a substance metaphysics and then undermines the argument you're making? And I want to hear what you think about that, because I know you've got a lot of wiggle room, but do you understand the challenge that I'm posing? If you're invoking person, and person
Yes.
is a prototypical example by Aristotle of what a substance is, right? The bearer, a subject that's never a predicate. And of course, we build morality around that idea of personhood. They are subjects that should never be reduced to being predicates. And Kant's categorical imperative is just a version of that, I would argue. So, people are always ends, never means only, etc. What do you say to that? It's like, isn't there a problem with understanding the Trinity as persons that undermines the claim of it as pointing to pure relationality as ultimate ground? So, did you understand the challenge I'm posing?
Yes. I suppose that the thought is that if this Aristotelian notion of the person as the bearer of certain properties, that seems to fit right into the model that James is rejecting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I mean, even in Aristotle, I say we might disagree about this. And again, it comes to one of my sort of queries about the project. And here I'm sure I'd have Jonathan Pageau and others on my back. But I mean, I as you know, I'm a great fan of the Cambridge Platonists, and in many ways they were Greek thinkers. So they were attuned to the Greek legacy, and I think you might find some of their reasons appealing, because they were reacting to a rather dogmatic Calvinistic theology, particularly one of double predestination, and they felt this was sub-Christian, and they felt that this dogmatic predestinarian, heavily Augustinian theology was ultimately incompatible with the spiritual life, and with what they regard as the necessary fusion of philosophy and theology. And of course, they were criticized at the time for being latitudinarians, the men of latitude or wide berth, i.e., they were being far too liberal in their theology, and were attacked vigorously by both the high churchmen and the the Reformed tradition. But so I'm very attracted to the Greek tradition. But first of all, there is I don't think I'm being unfair if I say that there is a very strong anti-intellectualist dimension to the Greek and Russian Orthodox tradition. Very often you have to tell Orthodox students that Neoplatonism has played such a strong role in their own tradition.
Yes.
And I've had the experience of both Orthodox students and Muslims come to me and say, thank you for showing me that Neoplatonism is part of a tradition that I'd sort of intuitively accepted, but wasn't aware that it was really part of the intellectual structure of my own inherited theology.
Yeah.
So there's a strange sense in which there is a somewhat moribund aspect to Eastern Orthodoxy that contrasts unfavorably, I would say, with a lot of the dynamism in Western theology. Now, I'd say I'm sure a lot of people will be unhappy with my saying that, but I think that's significant. So even though I was very impressed by that section of James's book where he's talking about the Cappadocian Fathers, it's interesting that he should exclude St. Augustine. Now, books 9 and 10 of De Trinitate, I think, constitutes one of the most important parts of Western philosophy. And there's an interesting article by an eminent German philosopher called Kurt Flasch, and it's called Die Rehabilitierung der Relation, or the rehabilitation of relation. And he sees that as based in Augustine's De Trinitate and then in John Scott Eriugena. So the article is mainly about John Scott. And of course, then Scott is important for James's book. Of course, John Scott, wonderful character living in the court of Charles the Bald, the great Irishman who's brought over to translate Denis the Areopagite into Latin. And he is a thinker who is deeply influenced by the Greek fathers and Denis and Maximus, but also by Augustine. So I think I think it's a bit unfair to artificially exclude this relational metaphysics from the Western tradition. As much as I'm a great admirer of the Eastern Christian Church, and I've become increasingly fascinated by it in the last few years. The other thing is, I just want to raise this in terms of the idealistic tradition, which as you know, I'm interested in. I've been influenced by this in my studies in Germany. And in fact, I'd say one of the characteristic differences between the German reception of Neoplatonism and the French, for example, is that the Germans are much more deeply influenced in their interpretation of Neoplatonism by Hegel and Schelling and the idealistic tradition. Now, that's interesting because it means there's a greater emphasis on the intellect in Plotinus than the one. I mean, one of the key issues in the interpretation of Neoplatonism is how do we understand the relationship between the one and the intellect? And in a sense, Christian theology, Trinitarian theology, telescoped the one and the intellect, so that the absolute principle becomes a relational principle. And you could now see that in terms of an interesting influence of Marius Victorinus via Porphyry and his influence on St. Augustine. But there's, I think, as James is suggesting, a distinctively Christian influence upon the Neoplatonic tradition. But to leave out that other strand, I say from Porphyry to Marius Victorinus and Augustine, seems to me, just in terms of the history of philosophy, to be short-circuiting something. And of course, via that tradition, we have a legacy into figures like Hegel.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the fact that Hegel should be just as adamantly rejecting a sort of substance accidents metaphysics as any of the Greek fathers is significant here. Now, I take the point of James's argument that Heidegger is putting a stress on relation that is intriguingly novel. I think one could see it as a radicalization of Husserl. So I think,
yeah, that's fair.
But in a way, there's a sense in which he's part of, I think, of a broader strand. And this is something I learned from reading James's books. I never really, even though I was conscious of these sort of covertly Neoplatonic elements in Heidegger, I hadn't thought of it in terms of the centrality of relation. But now I can see through James's book this link between a centrality of this notion of relation that is not the dominant strand in Western metaphysics, but I would say emerges from time to time. And of course, it's no accident that Hegel should think that the doctrine of the Trinity is absolutely key to his own metaphysical system. I mean, it's linked to the fact that he's not proposing a substance ontological system, but one in which you have a Geist ontological or a spirit ontological system. And that, of course, what's decisive for Geist? Well, it's the bei sich selber sein im anderen, as he says. It's the being yourself in the other. So that's why he thinks that the Trinity is this central Vorstellung or imaginary or in your language, symbol, because it is capturing a truth about reality that the traditional substance metaphysics cannot capture. So these would be just a few remarks about the kind of history of philosophy in the book.
That's good. And I think your point comes out well in the fact, and I'm not totally on board with James's critique of Whitehead, because Whitehead is in some ways Hegel plus a recapturing of Platonism. And process philosophy, trying to put it in deep dialogue with the scientific worldview. And I'm not so sure that, I get James's critique that, Whitehead seems to still privilege actuality over potentiality, and that's losing some of what the Neoplatonists were on about. As you said, being is more, the deepest possible potentiality, but it's also a power. So I take that point well, but before we turn to that, I just want to make sure we close off this previous point. So I grant you everything. And I would put Whitehead, like I said, in that line you're pointing to. In the West, no, there's been this, and Whitehead is clearly birthed out of that whole tradition. He reads it quite deeply. He references it. So I think, and the fact that shows up in James's book. And I think there should be more of a critical engagement with Whitehead there. That's one of my criticisms of the book. But putting that aside, I'm not putting it aside, acknowledging that, and then going further. I want to go back. Now I'm asking you to now step out and answer as a profound teacher about the imaginal, the imagination, which you've invoked a couple times here as. And it's not a faculty, you make that very clear, but as our cognitive capacity for coming into strong transcendence, realization of the one, etc. I still didn't hear what you think about how standard Christianity has tended to understand the Trinity in terms of persons, and the model of the persons are like entities like us, and that, of course, is interesting. And there's a whole tradition of us being the image of God that's at work there.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, this seems to me to be antagonistic to the proposal of relationality, unless you move to a non-Aristotelian understanding of the person, as which you're already getting in Dasein, and you're already getting in Hegel, and you're getting in Forty Coxai, that the person is inherently dialogical.
Yes,
right?
yes, yeah.
Not monological, not substantial, but inherently dialogical, horizontally and vertically. And so you understand a person that way. And so I'm asking, do you see that move as the way of of responding to my? You say, no, we don't have to abandon the person language. We can go back to hypostasis, yes. And then what we're doing is giving up the thing model of person and the monological model and moving to a dialogical. That's what I was sort of asking.
In fact, rejecting the atomistic model of the person.
Yes, right? Yes, exactly.
I mean, the great Goethe says, "Werde was du bist, become what you are."
Yeah.
And that paradox, of course, which is such a profound paradox of the spiritual life, doesn't make sense on this atomistic model of the person.
Yeah, it doesn't account. I mean, when you think that way, you hit Galen Strawson's paradox of self-transcendence, right? If it's just the self growing, there's no transcendence, and if it's other than the self, then it's transcendence but not self-transcendence, and because you're bound into this particular model of the self as a thing.
And that's one reason why. Later this year, I'm looking forward to talking to you about theosis and this, mysterious and rather puzzling notion that's so central in the Eastern Church. And I say it's something that we don't think of in quite the same way or with the same centrality in the West. But that's a really baffling and yet core idea of the self, with intriguing parallels with Asian thought. I mean,
deeply, I think, yeah.
But tvam asi, that thou art. How do you understand? How do you understand that? Well, the question of the person is, well, one of the great metaphysical mysteries, but it's not a, to use Marcel's distinction between a problem and a mystery. It's I think it's not one of those issues that we can solve with the analytic intellect, but it's not simply some dogmatic stipulation. I think the idea of the person is a profound idea that accompanies the great metaphysical tradition and, of course, the great spiritual traditions of the West.
Yeah, and you're right. It makes deep connections to Vedanta. I'm studying Vedanta quite deeply right now. Sarah, you will get to meet. She just got her certification as a yoga teacher, and a proper yoga, not just exercise, but the pranayama, the meditation, the Advaita Vedanta, right? Mm-hmm. Philosophy, the whole package. And so we're actually reading the Upanishads together, and we're talking about this.
Wonderful.
So yeah. I'm lucky to have such a partner. I appreciate that move. I think, not to get into this because we will be talking about it later, but I do think a dialogical model of the self with strong transcendence makes theosis more understandable. I think if you're in a monological, and all you have is a monological model of the self, and all you have is a psychological notion of self-transcendence, theosis cannot make sense to you.
No, it's completely unintelligible.
Yeah. And I like you invoking Marcel. I think love is actually a commitment to the mystery of something in a profound way.
Yes.
So I take that. I take that very well.
And I think indeed that I mean, we've spoken about this before, but the question of love in Western thought, that is a profound and beautiful contribution of, I know you're going to object to this, John, but I'd say of the Christian inheritance.
I don't object to it. I think, no, I don't object to that. This is what I mean when I say I prefer Christian Neoplatonism over pagan Neoplatonism, not because there is not a lot to be learned from Plotinus and Proclus and Iamblichus. There is, and and our mutual colleague Gregory Shaw has done a lot, revived that for us. And there's a whole ritual way of life associated with it. But I think the development of eros, especially in Dionysius, and taken up in Maximus, Dionysius is aware of the distinction we sort of retrospectively impose on people between what we call eros and what he calls agape. But he prefers the term eros because eros is the wanting to be one. And he has this wonderful thing about the relationship between eros and agape. And you don't get that deep, profound reflection in pagan Neoplatonism. And I think it's odd that Heidegger, who has care at the centrality of Dasein, of human being, doesn't get into deep discussion about love. Because again, and this is a Neoplatonic argument, I think love requires strong transcendence and, right, not just horizontal, but right? Yes. That's the symposium. That's the main argument of the symposium, right? And without that, you can't talk profoundly about love. So I think that's why there's this telling absence in Heidegger, the grandfather of existentialism, of this. And love isn't an emotion or a feeling. It's a profound existential mode. And so how is this profound existential mode largely missing? Well, I think that's, again, I think the absence of a deep discourse about love is part of the hostility towards strong transcendence as a real possibility.
Yes, I wonder whether also Nietzsche, it's the legacy of this sort of aristocratic contempt for the Christian inheritance that is stressing humility and compassion and love, and the emphasis upon Entschlossenheit and Entscheidung. I mean, all this language, this tough language, which you could put into context of the horrors of the early 20th century. But I wonder whether there's part of this sort of aristocratic tradition of Machiavelli and Nietzsche, which stresses pagan virtue, manly fortitude, rather than this Christian compassion and love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good argument as well, Douglas. I think that's a very good point. I think the Nietzschean rejection of love, especially as his pejorative sense of the feminine.
Exactly. And I think that's all part of Nietzsche's very profound and complicated relationship with both Schopenhauer and Wagner. So again, that brings us into the Eastern tradition, where Nietzsche wants to go back to the pre-Socratics, what he sees as this more primordial Greek affirmation of life, and rather than the resignation that he associates with Schopenhauerian tinged Eastern religion and Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Well said. That's interesting. Again, the absence of the reflection of the hard work that it was already done within Neoplatonism back in Plotinus of separating itself distinctly and cleanly from a kind of Gnostic attitude, I think would have also helped maybe attenuate that Nietzschean influence on Heidegger to some degree. That's interesting because I mean we're in this weird double bind about the body and embodiment right now. We, in one sense, it's almost a fetish and an idol in our bodies and our bodies and our bodies, and then on the other hand, there's this Gnostic desire to liberate ourselves from the confines of the body, and transhumanism
Exactly,
and
yeah.
my avatar.
Yeah.
There's this weird, and I think that's also partly because we've lost touch with the Christian Neoplatonic tradition that really tries to wrestle with a profound sense of embodiment. Capobianco,
Dante's smile, Beatrice's smile. The smile of Beatrice.
In Dante, yes.
Dante, yeah.
I was reading Capobianco, and he talks about the crucifix that was beloved by Saint Francis, and he makes a proposal for it of as one of the best icons of finite transcendence. That finitude and transcendence are completely held together in this icon. I don't know if he's aware of Hyland's argument that this is the core thing that Plato keeps trying to get us to. Don't lose your finitude or you'll become hubristic and tyrannical. Don't lose your transcendence or you will become servile and despairing, right? You have to hold the two together. And of course, this is the metaxu that William Desmond is making so much, makes so much with. And that was another moment with me where I was looking at it and I go, oh, wow, right. Christianity did something really powerful about, right, about the inhabitation of finite transcendence, and our something that is both humanizes us and also vectors us towards something greater than us. I thought that was just a profound thing. And so I think Nietzsche, again, and Heidegger, I think Heidegger's wrestling with finite transcendence and trying to understand how to hold them together. I mean, there's the thrownness and the finitude, but there's also, there's being, but he doesn't, it's hard to, what am I trying to say? It's hard to get that into something that can be enacted by the imagination, that can be imaginal for us. And I saw that Christian icon of the crucifix was very powerful. I actually purchased a version of it, and it was very interesting to see that in place. So I think that the rejection. I think that we have this two-way, double-bind, disastrous vacillation around the body because we can't properly get something analogous to embodiment, the incarnation, the crucifixion, how all those are bound up together as this rich ecology of symbols for helping us properly identify, inhabit our humanity. Sorry, that was a long argument, but I just wanted to.
No, and I think it's no accident that the later Heidegger is fascinated by poetry.
Yes.
And then this contrast between denken, dichten, or thought, and those strange utterances like "Die Wissenschaft denkt nicht," that science doesn't think.
Yes.
But of course, it's you could take that as a sort of Philistine rejection of science, which of course it isn't. But it's a thought about the significance of poetry, I think, which is at the same time so profoundly bodily.
Yes.
It's linked to our music, to dance, rhythm, and at the same time, poetry is archaic. It touches the roots of our humanity, but it's also, of course, the most precious articulation of transcendence.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. And I do see Christian Neoplatonism with the liturgy as enacted poiesis, enacted poetry, as also offering. I get Greg's argument about theurgy is also doing something like that, but right? The Christianity seems to have developed it very thoroughly. Douglas, we're running out of time, and I wanted to give you the opportunity for any last words you'd like to give us before we wrap things up. But before I pass it to you, this was thoroughly enjoyable. I had a wonderful time. I hope you did too.
No, I did, yes. Yeah.
And I hope we do this again. I do want to have you back and talk about your anthology, participation in the divine. And so, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk about this book. And I think it's a sign of a good book that it makes you rethink
Yeah.
your own position. And I certainly found this work a profound stimulus. And so even though I don't agree with everything that James Phillip is saying, I think this is a genuinely transformative work. And I think is part of a groundswell of interest in that rich metaphysical and theological tradition that we need so urgently.
What a beautiful and almost precise way to end it. Thank you so much, my good friend. And I look forward to seeing you in person soon in multiple locations and having you on again to talk about your anthology. Thank you so much, Douglas.
Thank you, John.